Hi, hello, welcome to this Introduction to European Union Law online course. My name is Harris, and I'm going to be lecturing you through some of the basics of EU law, which I know can be quite a confusing, quite a difficult area to get your head around, especially if you're a student studying it for the first time. So I'll be creating this online course to really break down the basics and give you the foundations of the EU. Like I said, my name is Harris and I'm a Scots Law graduate from the University of Glasgow. I graduated last year and just now I'm a private legal tutor specialising in international law and EU law. But mostly I just like to help students get through their degree and begin to really make the most out of their university experience. So if you don't know, this is not my first online course. I've created 3 others. Namely, I've created one on Introduction to Scots Law, which was my degree, and it really helps students get to grips with a Scottish law degree and what to expect before they begin their studies. Introduction to International Law, which was my favorite topic out of the lot, just because I specialized in it at university, where I give kind of a basic introduction to international law and international legal concepts. And finally, probably my most creative was law, goods and international trade, where I take the journey of a startup company and how it eventually becomes a multinational company, and looking at it through the lens of international trade law. So all 3 courses are available on Udemy and Skillshare. You can purchase them. And if you require a discount code, email me and I can see what I can do for you. So who is this course aimed at? Well, it's aimed at a number of people, namely undergraduate students or bachelor students, those who are studying EU law at university. EU law can hit you very, very hard. You can get knee deep in trade regulations right from the very beginning. So having a background and a foundation before you start your course is really, really important. Additionally, there are a lot of master's students who are about to encounter something to do with the EU or something related to the European Union. And so for them, having background knowledge about European Union law is actually very, very important. So for them, this will be a very useful course as well. For foreign lawyers outside of Europe, the EU can be an enigma. So learning about the European Union will be very important, perhaps if you're looking to practice in the EU, or perhaps if you're just moving to a European country. And the general public, right? Curious people interested in law or politics or countries or culture or economics. So this course will have something for everyone. So in terms of the course topics, this is a very, very brief course. I'm not going to have 10 or 12 lectures, and I try and keep all my courses very, very brief. And so we're going to be talking first about the history of the EU, which actually is more like a background and a context behind the European Union and why it's so important. We're going to be looking at institutions of the European Union, principles, the key EU principles that have shaped the European Union, the 4 freedoms, which is the pinnacle of what Europe stands for, and challenges, maybe future challenges, and that dreaded word, Brexit, as well. And in this lecture, we'll be looking at the history of the European Union. Now, with the European Union, I always see it as a bit of an enigma. People know what it is. People know that it must be important, but there is a real divide between the European Union institutions and Union citizens. So if you're a normal citizen in Slovakia or Greece or Spain, you know that the EU exists, you know that it's there, but you have so many questions, and there's almost like a class divide between the people who run the EU and normal citizens who are subject to the EU. And so because of that, I think there is a lot of misconceptions. People don't realize, don't understand how it is applicable in their own lives. And so because of that, I think there are a lot of questions that need to be answered. So here are some common questions I think that normal Europeans have about the European Union. And most of these questions have actually come from me interviewing normal people, right? So interviewing friends and family and asking them, well, if you wanted any question answered about the EU, what would it be? So these are the kind of things that come up. Like, what does your MEP actually do? What caused Brexit? What does it mean for Europe? Who actually runs the EU? And so throughout these 5 lectures that I'm going to deliver, we're going to answer each one of these questions, just so I can bring this all back to practicalities, to basics, right? How does it affect us as individual citizens? So let's get on with the first lecture. And when we talk about history and we talk about the EU, I think it's really important to look at the timeline and how we got here, right? How we got to 2021 and how we got to 27 sovereign states being part of an economic union. We have to go all the way back to the 19th century in order to really get to grips with this. We start with the 19th century, and you start with the rise of this thing called nationalism between European states, right? People take for granted that today we have countries, actual countries. Well, before, wasn't always like that. There weren't secure borders the same way there is today. The reason we have borders is because of this sense of nationalism that began to rise among European people. That was one of the biggest causes of the two world wars, not just World War I, but World War II especially. But especially at the end of 1945, when a ridiculous number of people are dead. I think it was 80 million or something are dead. People realize that actually something's got to give in Europe, right? And you can't keep having wars every few years, because then life's just not worth living. And so this was the inspiration for the creation of the European Coal and Steel Community in 1951, first ever European organization between different sovereign nations, evolving into the European Economic Community, the Single European Act, the Treaty on the European Union, and finally we had the Lisbon Treaty, which kind of summarized everything and is the most recent major treaty which lays the foundations for the EU. Now we're going to be, like I said, we're going to be looking at each one of these milestones in turn and how they were important. So just a quick note about nationalism. I spoke earlier about just how before the 19th century, or during the 19th century, there weren't distinct borders between countries, and that's not entirely true, but there wasn't a rigid sense of nation states like we have in Europe. Actually, Europe looked like this before World War I. What you had was the Russian Empire on the east, which encompassed a lot of countries, so modern day countries, so Russia and Kazakhstan and Belarus, etc. And we had the German Empire and the Austria-Hungarian Empire. And so these three empires, as you can see, were empires that encompassed different people. So you would have had in the Austria-Hungarian Empire, Austrians and Hungarians, as well as lots and lots of other cultures and nationalities. Now, they felt part of a group, but they were administered by the empire, right? So it wasn't like you had a separate country of Austria and separate country of Hungarian, and both Austria and Hungary, they would have been Austrians and Hungarians. No, they was under one empire. And the problem with empires is that once nationalist sentiment begins to build, it's very difficult for the empire to begin to control that and make sure that those people have allegiance to the empire and not their own nationality. And actually, in history, the only way that empires have done that is through force. And when you use force against the people who believe that they have a right to defend themselves, well, then you get war. And that's exactly what happened in Europe in the early 20th century. We had World War I and World War II, largely caused by nationalist sentiment. And especially after the fall of the German, Austro-Hungarian, and Russian empires after World War I, there was kind of like an interim period between World War I and World War II, where nations were getting to grips with this new idea of nationalism, this new state-centric world that they had built. And that can cause some problems, especially when some people feel subjugated and when there's not really an international legal system. So instead of nationalism becoming this force for good, this idea of allowing a subjugated people, a minority, their right to govern themselves, it actually became a poison in Europe. And because of that, governments actually began to wage war on other governments. That culminated in both world wars, and by the end of 1945, that 80 million people died as a result of both wars. And so by the end of World War II, largely through war itself, but also famine, starvation, disease, because of that, 3% of the world's population was just wiped off this planet. And these were people, 80 million people who had lives and dreams, families, and just totally wiped off, generations wiped off the planet. And so because of this, the world had to become very introspective, especially European leaders and people who had lived through the war had to become very, very introspective and realize the current system wasn't working. And so we would have required something to restore order and stability and peace. And so 6 countries met up in Paris in France, and they created the European Coal and Steel Community. And the European Coal and Steel Community, created in 1951, was the first ever European international organization And before this, it was almost impossible to think that sovereign states could be joined together without an empire. But this idea of having an international organization where France could still be French, France could still be France, and Germany could still be Germany, yet they could be part of a union, that was pretty much unheard of at that point. So this was a dramatic kind of shift in how Europeans saw themselves, or Europeans saw nation states as a whole. It was made up of 6 countries initially. A lot of the other European countries didn't join because of various reasons. They felt as if their sovereignty was being eroded as people. They felt as if there wasn't enough benefits in joining these communities, but 6 countries did join. And the purpose overall was to eliminate trade barriers between countries and reduce the risk of war. Now, why trade barriers? Well, I spoke about this in my Law, Goods and International Trade lecture. So if you want to check that out. But essentially, when you have countries trading with each other, making money from each other, they're less likely to go to war with each other. So they're less likely to fight. And when everyone's trading and no one's fighting, that means most people then are also getting pretty rich. And I think everyone in the world would rather be driving Lamborghinis than going onto the battlefield. And so because of that, the European coal and steel community allowed for this to happen. Initially, however, the only thing that was being traded was coal and steel. Now, the reason it was just coal and steel was because really this entire organization that initially was created was for 2 countries, for Germany and for France, because these 2 were major players in World War II. And both of these countries had a border with each other, which meant that it was very, very easy for one to attack the other, which is exactly what happened during World War II. And so the idea was to get Germany and France to cooperate with each other in the heart of Europe so that other countries could follow suit. And the best way to cooperate is to trade 2 resources, coal and steel. Why coal and steel? Because those 2 resources are the main resources used to wage war. You can't build tanks without steel. You can't run machines without coal. You can't build weapons without either. And so to have them trading with these 2, it meant that they couldn't just go to war with each other because they would have been reliant on each other for the resources to go to war. And when you really, really reflect on this, this was an ingenious idea. I don't know who came up with this, but we can thank whoever did come up with it for 70 years of lasting peace in Europe. The economic coal and steel community became a real success. And so those 6 countries that created the economic coal and steel community wanted to go one step further and create a market for all products, not just coal and steel, which is exactly what happened. And so there were still 6 member states, but now the purpose was to extend the coal and steel community and create a common market for all goods and services. So it wasn't just coal and steel now, it was bananas, and it was, I was about to say mobile phones, but they didn't have that in 1957. But you get the gist, right? Any products that they had, they would then start to trade these 6 countries. And the effect was that trade barriers were eliminated for the first time in Europe, and goods and services flowed freely between countries and people, right? Because if you offer a service, people also flow freely. So that's when you've got this huge migration of Germans who moved to France, and French people who moved to Germany, and Italians who moved to Germany. And those generations exist today in Europe. People who can trace their lineages. If you're living in, let's say, for example, Germany, you trace your lineage, it's not German, it's actually Italian, or it's actually Dutch, right? And so it was this free flow of information and ideas, and clearly, the system has worked. By 1986, whatever this was, every other country wanted to get in on it as well. The European Union then began to expand exponentially. 6 more countries were added to the existing 6, including the UK and Ireland. And the purpose of the Single European Act was just to further integrate key countries in Europe. And the effect was quite practical. So there was quite a lot of long legislative procedures in the EU, which made passing resolutions quite slow. So that was shortened. Trade barriers, again, eliminated, but those rules were also refined. And in particular, the UK, is one of the richest countries in the world, was now part of this organization. And that just gave the European Union so much more credibility in the world. because there was more funding and we had this major player now who was part of the EU. And in 1992, we had the Treaty on the European Union, and that is where we get the name today, the European Union. It wasn't always like that. The number of countries stayed pretty much the same, except there was further integration. And the purpose now was to create an official economic union between the member states. So whereas before there was a kind of like an agreement where trade and services would flow, now this was all getting quite official. So there was an official economic union with policy and structure and an institution in Brussels which would regulate all of this. And integration was enhanced. And so some of the effects of doing this was that there were some provisions made by central European institutions to regulate foreign policy between countries so that they don't contradict each other. And there was shared EU citizenship of everyone. So whether you were born in Luxembourg or the UK or Italy, you were not only an Italian citizen or a Luxembourgish citizen, you were also a EU citizen. And so when people felt part of that organization, it meant that they were more likely to contribute to it. And of course, there was the creation of the euro as a single currency, which of course has its flaws, but you can clearly see where we're going with this, right? It's to further integrate as many countries as possible. And by the time the Treaty of Lisbon was passed in 2007, the EU had expanded exponentially from 12 countries to 27, right? And this was largely because of Eastern European enlargement. Countries who used to be part of the Soviet bloc, who used to be kind of under the thumb of Russia, actually now went west and wanted to embrace free market capitalism, were disillusioned with the Russian model, and so they became part of the EU. The EU took them in with open arms because the more people, the better, right? The more people, the more population, the more services, the more trade, the more credibility you can have across the world. And the purpose was actually to combine the European community, which existed as a separate community, and the Union into one entity. And that's today called the European Union. And the effect of this was to detail precise rules for regulation of EU institutions, governance, courts, policy, all that jazz. And so having seen the progress of the EU from humble beginnings all the way to this 27-state monster, we're going to answer a question. We're going to answer one of the first common questions is, why are some European countries still not part of the EU? Surely they would get some sort of benefit. Well, it depends, right? First of all, you need to realize that only European countries can really be part of the EU. Otherwise, it would kind of lose that identity that it's built up. And there's only a select number of countries in Europe, and all the big ones are part of the EU. And so some countries would rather be part of the common market, the internal market, but still not give up their sovereignty. Countries like Iceland and Norway. Some countries are actually on the list to join. It's called EU enlargement, but they need to air out some problems, right? There's maybe corruption in their system, maybe there's human rights abuses, etc. So that would include Serbia, Albania. Some countries have far too many internal conflicts and, like I said, poor human rights records. So Ukraine, Belarus. Ukraine is in a long-running dispute with Russia over Crimea. And the problem is, if the EU was to integrate Ukraine into Europe, if Russia was to attack Ukraine, the EU would be put in a very awkward position where it has to help Ukraine, yet at the same time, it doesn't want full-on war with Russia. That would defeat the whole purpose. And so it's in a very awkward position where I think it probably does want Ukraine to be part of the EU, but it knows Ukraine's baggage, right? There's a lot of issues. And so that would put the EU in a very awkward position. Simply, some countries are just too small to join. So there are some countries like Andorra and Monaco, which maybe the benefit of them joining the EU wouldn't be as great. And actually for them to join the EU wouldn't be great for them either. They're better off just governing themselves as autonomous territories and keeping good relations with all the countries across the world. I'll reference this textbook throughout the entire course. It's European Union Law by Christine Bernard. And the reason why I love this textbook is because in every single chapter, it's written by an expert instead of the same author. And so I've gotten most of my information from here. So if you're interested in going into a bit more detail on this course, feel free to check out this textbook. Hello, welcome back to this Introduction to European Union Law course. And in this lecture, we're going to be talking about institutions. First of all, I really want to get this concept out of the way. I want to look at, well, for normal people, right? Institution can be many things, but what is an institution, or what is the definition of an institution? This is how I like to look at institutions in general. In life, human beings have a goal, and they always have goals that they're trying to achieve, whether that's to stop war, like it is in the EU, or whether that's to educate people, like it is in a university, or whether that's to run a country, like it is in government. And so in order to achieve these goals, one man himself can't do them. The task is just far, far too big. You need a lot of resources. One of those resources you need is extra people. And so you could easily describe institutions as these groups of collective people, collective human beings, all striving to achieve one goal. And so with the European Union as an institution, it is an institution on its own, but it also has its sub-institutions which also try and achieve the overarching goal, or who have their own goals to regulate the economy, to make sure the people are happy, to make sure trade is going well, to make sure it's democratic. And so all of this is for the overarching goal of integrating Europeans, making people rich, stopping war. And so that's the best way to look at an institution and why we have them. This is a list of all the institutions. In fact, that's a lie. This is a list of some of the institutions in the European Union. And as you can see, there are a ridiculous amount. Now, one thing you need to know about the European Union in general is that it's filled with a bunch of bureaucrats. And if there's one thing that bureaucrats love, it's making things very, very difficult and complicated. And everyone wants to achieve the same goal, but they do it in a much more complicated fashion. And so one of the ways they do this is by creating lots and lots of different bodies and institutions, and then they all work for the same goal. Now, that's okay in practice, but the problem is when you're a student trying to learn EU law, it's almost impossible to memorize everything that EU law has to offer. Not only do we have 7 official institutions, 7 in the Treaty of the European Union, but there are at least 7 plus more other institutions and bodies who also help with the official bodies and who also have their own policy. That becomes a problem for students especially, and thankfully for you, I have taken the time to read about the 7 official ones and really try and break them down into 1 or 2 lines at most. And so this will give you some foundations to go on and understand what institutions actually are. But I can absolutely empathize with people who are just too bored to learn this. But actually you realize how it all kind of links in. The 7 official institutions are listed in the Treaty in the European Union in Article 13. And it's the Parliament, the Council of the EU, which is different to the European Council, the European Commission, Court of Justice, Central Bank, and the Court of Auditors. And we'll look at each one in turn and how it relates to the legislative process, because this is a law course. And so we won't be focusing on the politics of it. We'll be looking at the law. Firstly, let's map out how all the institutions relate to one another and how they actually interact. So if we take the European Council as the heads of state of each government, they would probably relate more to the European Commission, because they would be in constant discussions with the European Commission on what their country needs in terms of laws. And so if the European Council is made up of presidents and prime ministers, they're going to represent the member states, and they will then go to the Commission to tell them, actually, look, we need laws on these kind of things, on specific issues, etc. The Commission would then draft up what we call a proposal. And once they draft up this proposal, it's sent to the European Parliament and the Council of Ministers, both to debate the proposal, to amend it, to scrutinize it before it actually becomes legislation itself. And eventually, after days of talking, they will end up passing the legislation, and then you'll have the law. Now, I've got a banana as the icon for this law, and I'll explain why in a minute, but that's basically the example legislation that we're going to use, a bit bananas. And so once you've passed this banana law, it can then go to 2 other institutions. The first is the European Court of Justice, and they will settle any debates that are regarding the legislation. So if someone takes the EU to court on the passing of laws to bananas, then the Court of Justice will deal with this. And you also have the Court of Auditors, which is not a court. Actually, their role is to set the budget for implementing the legislation itself. And then finally, we have the last institution, the European Central Bank. It doesn't directly relate to any legislation, but what it will do is it will regulate the euro, and make sure that the rating for inflation is not too high for member state economies, and make sure actually each country's economy, or the ones who adopt the euro anyway, is sufficiently strong enough for this legislation to be implemented. So feel free to take a screenshot or to take note of this infographic here. I think this is going to be one of the most useful pictures that you might use when you study EU law. Let's begin first with the European Council. So with each institution that I look at, I'm going to analyze two things. I'm going to analyze their composition, as in who makes up that institution. And I'm going to look at their role in the legislative process. Okay, only two things. There are many other things that I can talk about, but this is an EU law course, right? And we're not talking about European institutions as a political entity. We're looking at them as legal entities. So when it comes to the composition of the European Council, it consists of heads of state, right? 27 members, there's 27 members, and they're heads of state. That includes prime ministers, presidents, chancellors. And this woman is part of it, Angela Merkel. She's the Chancellor of Germany, which essentially is the prime minister or the head of Germany, right? So she'll be on that European Council. The role in the legislative process is to appoint members to the European Commission, which states will often appoint commissioners who will represent their interests, right? So they're not going to appoint a commissioner who isn't going to toe the country's party line. And this is where we come to the law that we're going to discuss or use as an example throughout the discussion of institutions. And so I said before how the European Council will take the interests of their people, their citizens, and look at laws that they need to talk to the Commission about, the laws that they need to, that the Commission need to create a proposal about. So let's say all the Union citizens now want to change the color of bananas, right? I don't know physically how you would do that, but it might be possible. But now let's say everyone in Germany and Greece and France wants bananas to be red and not yellow. So bearing that in mind, the Council will go to the Commission, and the Commission will be composed of what we call the College of Commissioners, which is 27 commissioners appointed by the Council from each member state. And each member will be in charge of a certain department in the EU. So monetary policy or trade or climate change. And that's Ursula von der Leyen. She is the president of the Commission just now. And so in terms of the law that now Union citizens want about changing the color of bananas, it'd now be the role of the Commission to make a proposal that would detail the practicalities of changing the color of bananas from yellow to red. And they would propose this legislation or create the proposal and send it off to the Council of Ministers and the Parliament. The proposal itself will look a bit like this. Okay, it'll say proposal for a directive of the European Parliament and the Council on the changing of colors of bananas in the European Union from yellow to red. So very, very simple. And this would be something now that the next two institutions will look at, will be debating, amending, and trying to pass as law. So in the European Parliament, which is composed of 705 MEPs from all 27 member states, elections will take place every 5 years. Normally turnout's very low, it's at about 40%, because people don't feel a connection to the European Union. And what happens is domestic political parties will run in the elections, and depending on the number of votes there are, they will be grouped into the EU Parliament depending on their political views. So if there's a domestic political party who is more right-wing, they'll be grouped into a more right-wing set of political parties from other countries in the EU. Same with left-wing, socialist, etc., etc. David Sassoli on the left, that he is now currently the president of the Parliament. Of course, its role in the legislative procedure is obvious. It will receive the proposal from the Commission, scrutinise, debate, and amend it. Now, I remember doing a European Union simulation of this exact thing, right? So it was like a 3-day event where a bunch of us, about 40 or 50 people, would take part in a 3-day event where we would take the role of a member of parliament from a specific country and a specific party, and then debate and amend and scrutinise a piece of legislation or a proposal for 3 days, essentially, and passing it. It was great fun. There were socials and stuff. It was excellent. But it really put me into the shoes of what it takes to be an MEP. And so I was an MEP for a socialist party in Cyprus. And what you notice, especially in the European Parliament, is that the groups in each parliament rarely deviate from each other. You'll have one group with lots and lots of different countries in there and different interests. yet normally they act in harmony, right? So if the group decides that actually they're not going to accept this proposal or accept this amendment, then there aren't many outliers there, right? They're probably all just sing in unison. And so we found the issue, especially when we were when we were doing a simulation in Parliament, if we wanted an amendment passed and if we wanted a proposal passed, you had to get the backing of the big groups in Parliament. And actually, that doesn't happen in the debate chamber. That happens during coffee breaks and the socials and outside of the actual official debating chamber itself. So in summary, if most parliamentary groups are against the proposal, it'll probably not get passed because MPs will rarely defect from the views of their group in Parliament. And this leads us on to another common question about the EU, which is, what does your MEP actually do? Many people don't know who their MEP is. They don't actually know what he does or why he's getting paid to do what he does. But in general, this is what they do. They'll scrutinize, they'll debate, they'll amend EU law, and they'll travel to and from the European Parliament in Brussels. And they'll also meet with other MEPs in their parliamentary group and be part of focus groups and projects and stuff like this throughout Europe. The Council of Ministers, very, very similar to the European Parliament in terms of its role. However, its composition is very, very different. So it's unelected, it's not democratic, and it consists of 27 ministers from each member state, and they're appointed by the member state governments. Now, what's interesting with the Council of Ministers is it's not set like the Commission. So European Parliament changes every 5 years, but that's elections. You can see how that works. And the Commission is appointed. There's only one person that's appointed to the Commission by the Council. With the ministers, the Council of Ministers, there's not just a set group. The composition of the Council of Ministers will change depending on the issue that needs to be debated. So let's say, for example, the proposal is about trade law. Well, then what you would get is different ministers from each country who specialize in trade law. If the proposal is about fisheries policy, then you would get ministers from the member states who specialize in fisheries policy, and so on and so on. And so the Council of Ministers is much more flexible, and you can think about it as a revolving door of experts who come in and out and who are not set in their composition. And so Jip Tranholm Mikkelsen, he is right now the Secretary General of the Council. Its role, again, is the same as the Parliament. Receive the proposal, scrutinise it, debate it, amend it. I've done 2 European simulations, one where I was a Parliament member, but one where I was a Council Minister for Belgium, actually. And what I found, especially when I was the Council Minister, there was less of us, not as many as there is in Parliament. So there's more people in Parliament, there's less in the Council Ministers. And you're on your own in terms of representing your country. And it was much more taxing as a process to create amendments, to pass things, to get into agreements and disagreements, because you're on your own and you're not really helped out by other party members. It's really just a lone wolf process. And so it made me appreciate the work that Council Ministers especially go through. However, by the end of all of these discussions, which in my case in that simulation was 3 days, in reality can sometimes take up to 3 years, what you'll have is a nice polished EU directive. And this directive will state that this is a directive of the European Parliament on the changing of colours of bananas from yellow to red. And it will have all the necessary provisions in it for bananas to now be red instead of yellow. The Court of Justice of the European Union will play a role in settling disputes that are related to the legislation. In terms of composition of the court, there's not just one court called the Court of Justice of the European Union. The Court of Justice of the European Union is the institution. Within that, there are actually 2 courts that are important. The first one is the European Court of Justice, consisting of 27 judges from each member state and 11 advocate general, whose opinions are not legally binding, but they're highly respected. These people are extremely knowledgeable about EU law. And there's also another court called the General Court, which consists of 54 judges, 2 from each member state. This court was created after the ECJ to help with the increased workload that they were constantly getting. And that's Koen Leenaerts. He's the president of the institution of the court. In terms of their specific roles, the ECJ, that's the first one, will here create cases from national courts on preliminary rulings and direct actions, as in if a domestic court needs to clarify something about EU law, then it can take this to the ECJ. And the EGC, that's the General Court, it will hear cases directly from individuals and companies about non-compliance with EU law by a state or institution. So if you are a union citizen and you feel like your rights have been violated, then you can go directly to the European General Court and make your claim. The European Court of Auditors is not a court, it's actually more of a regulatory body which will regulate spending in the EU. And so its composition consists of a bunch of auditors from each member state. Klaus-Heiner Lehner, he's the president just now of the Court of Auditors. And so these guys will set the budget for the EU and make sure there's no over or underspending. And so their role is to set the budget of the EU, handle their financial affairs, track spending, and make sure there's no over underspending, make sure there's no financial corruption. And like I said, it's not technically a court, and its decisions are not binding, legally binding. Finally, you'll be glad to know we have the European Central Bank, and it's composed of staff. So not specifically any ministers who are appointed, but just a bunch of staff, and specifically 3,500 all across Europe, including bankers and advisors and economists. And that's Christine Lagarde. She is the president of the bank just now. And their role is to regulate the Eurozone, which consists of 19 member states who use the euro as their currency. I did a year abroad in Germany in my third year of university, and it was in a city called Mainz, which is about 30 minutes train ride away from Frankfurt. And Frankfurt hosts the European Central Bank. And so I was lucky enough to be part of a group who got a tour from an economist at the ECB. And as you walk into the ECB, what you'll see is that there is a museum on your left-hand side on the ground floor, which kind of just details the history of the bank and what its main aims are, its objectives, and how it's changed people's lives and stuff. But there was one statistic that kept coming up over and over again when I was doing this tour, and it was literally plastered everywhere. And this was that inflation has to be kept at around 2%. And that is one of the main targets of the ECB. You might be wondering, well, why is inflation such an obsession for the EU? Well, the reason for this is that so inflation has tended to go up every single year since the Industrial Revolution. And the problem is when inflation goes up a little bit too much, let's say 10% or 20%, things, that's products, get too expensive. And so if you take the average price of products, you have a kind of set price and you know what you're going to get next year. If next year you realize actually that all the products that you're buying have gone more expensive, yet your wages, the money coming in is stagnated. But what that does, that causes a lot of resentment between people. And we have the EU, which is full of over 300 million people. If inflation gets out of control and yet wages stagnate, what you actually have is a bunch of people who begin to get very, very angry with the institutions and the elites in Europe and in their governments. And what that can do is when people get really angry and they can no longer afford essentials like food and sanitary equipment, that can breed hate and anger, resentment, and that could topple the entire system itself. So it's really, really important for the EU to work on keeping economic inflation at constant rates so that people aren't surprised year on year, because the EU then lose legitimacy and that can result in the downfall of the entire system. So you can understand why this is such a key target. It's more than just economics. This is about everything that underpins society. Another question that I got asked by a friend, and he said, well, who actually runs the EU? Essentially, which one is the one that's at the top? Which one's running it? As I've just discussed, no single institution has all the power. They're all subject to each other. And the idea is that power is shared between all the different institutions, and there's a system of checks and balances between each institution. Hello, welcome back. We're on to lecture number 3 of this Introduction to European Union Law online course. And in this lecture, we're going to be looking at the principles of the European Union. And so these are principles that the courts have laid down, which ultimately, as you'll see, is what creates the link between a normal union citizen and how they can enforce EU law against their member states and uphold their rights under the EU. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about 3 specific principles, which I think are not only the most important and the most fundamental. You'll be heavily examined on them during your degree, I'm sure, just because they're so important. But I think they're also important because these are the principles that normal people can rely on when they are taking their member state to court, because maybe the government hasn't implemented a legal right that they're entitled to. And this is where the EU Court of Justice can actually act as a friend for union citizens. They can act as a very, very effective balance against member state governments from trampling on the rights of their own citizens. So the first principle that we're going to be looking at is direct effect, the principle of direct effect. The second will be indirect effect, which, interestingly enough, they're not opposite principles, they're actually very, very similar to each other. And the third one will be supremacy or primacy of EU law. Let's begin first with direct effect. Now, the principle was first mentioned and created in a case called Van Genden-Loos. And direct effect is essentially where a law is passed by the EU, and this is effective in a member state without the need for that member state to implement the law through domestic legislation. So if we take this as an example, if there's EU law that has been passed down from the Parliament and the Council and it now becomes law, and that can be enforced in a country such as Italy by EU citizens themselves. Italy doesn't need to enact a domestic act of parliament to say that this European law is an act of parliament. Those Italian citizens can rely on that directive or that regulation from the EU against the Italian government without it being domestic law. And so this is why we have this direct connection between the EU institutions and their citizens as union citizens. However, there is a caveat, and the three caveats specifically are that laws can only be directly effective, as in you can only make use of this provision if they are sufficiently clear and precise, so there's no ambiguity regarding the EU legislation itself. They're unconditional, which means that you don't need to apply them with conditions on top. And it can only be relied on directly if the member state, such as Italy, has either failed to implement that European law in the required time period, or it's implemented it incorrectly. When you go onto the subject and you research further, you'll find that it's not always as easy as it seems, and there are some other hurdles to go through. But the idea is that there is some sort of cooperation between an EU citizen and an EU institution. And it's not just the case that the member state has to act as a stopgap every time a piece of European legislation is issued. Moving on with indirect effects, this was first mentioned in a case called Van Colson. And in indirect effect, this is the principle whereby member states have a duty to interpret all national laws in conformity with EU law. So there can't be any deviations, there can't be any inconsistencies with EU law, because if there are, that will create problems if an EU citizen wants to enforce his rights in real life or in court. That causes a problem, especially for people in European countries, because their allegiances are now being split. On the one hand, they're a European citizen, and they're being told that you can enforce European law directly as a union citizen. On the other hand, they're also a citizen of their member state, and the member state has much more control. And so having this divide will inevitably cause a lot of problems. So this principle is there to stop that. Like I said, an example is that France cannot pass national legislation which is going to contradict laws that are passed by the EU. And in fact, this will apply to legislation already enacted by France even before, say, for example, it joined the EU. So let's say French legislation was passed which contradicts EU legislation, but this was before France joined the EU. Let's say it has a law from 1786. This law would also be subject to the requirement, because the idea is that member state governments cannot rely on any laws which would directly conflict with the EU as long as they are a member of the EU. And so what it would require in theory is France to repeal the outdated or old legislation and replace it with new European Union legislation which is consistent and up to date. In practice, this can be quite problematic. And the reason it's problematic is because what you're essentially saying is that French legislation should conform to EU legislation and not the other way around. And so this can be problematic in terms of sovereignty. Unfortunately, you can't run an organization when each country is passing its own laws and contradicting one another. All in all, the aim of the principle is just to ensure consistency between EU and domestic law, so that a European Union citizen, such as someone from Slovakia or Romania, can happily travel to the Netherlands or to France and know that the laws are fairly consistent on the EU level and that some weird domestic regulation isn't going to scupper all their plans. And the final principle that I want to talk about is supremacy. Spoke previously about indirect effect and consistency. Well, this takes it one step further, right? Now we're talking about supremacy of EU law. So supremacy or primacy, they're both called the same. Primacy of EU law is a principle whereby EU law takes precedence over national laws in the event of a conflict. So let's say there is a conflict, right? A really, really specific one between French legislation and European legislation. In that case, theoretically, there's only one winner, and it's EU law. So the rationale, the idea behind this is very similar to indirect effect. But the rationale is that when states join the EU and sign up to this international organization, essentially what they're doing when they sign on that dotted line is they give up part of their sovereignty and lawmaking powers, and they hand it off to the European Union. Now, ideally, every state wants to control all the laws within its borders, but a lot of the time that's quite inefficient. And so the EU says, well, we'll take some of your lawmaking powers, but in return, what you'll get is the EU's economic and political benefits. And so yes, EU law reigns supreme over national law, and it can be seen as this overarching exotic type of law. But the idea is that the member states are getting a benefit out of it, right? So the idea is that by doing this, by giving EU law the reins here, they are part of this economic union where trade flows freely. Now, you can clearly see the controversial nature of a rule like this, because what you're saying is that the EU will decide laws for our country. And citizens who have no idea what the EU is, and they don't really relate to it much, and they don't understand it very well, they just think it's a bunch of elitist bureaucrats in Brussels who don't represent them, they'll be pretty pissed off if there are laws that their country is supposed to decide, yet there's this institution, Brussels, that decides them. And you could even say, and this is one of the major reasons for Brexit, people don't want their laws coming from someone else, they don't want their sovereignty restricted, and they want to take back control of all laws, regardless of the economic and political benefits, if there are any for them. So finally, we're going to ask the question about how the EU actually affects normal people. Well, you've just seen those three principles, and really that's how it affects normal people. EU citizens are able to enforce their legal rights under EU law against their government and other organizations, and it also affects them in terms of giving up some of their sovereignty in their country for the EU to make laws for them, and in return get economic and political benefits, which is not always the case, and which can lead to a bit of resentment. Hello, welcome back to this Introduction to European Union Law online course. And in this fourth lecture, we're going to be talking about the four freedoms. Now, this is where I think the foundations of the European Union actually lie. And we'll be exploring exactly how the EU trades, and through the internal market, how it's been able to galvanize European countries who previously were fighting each other through world wars, and now they're trading with each other and exchanging ideas and information. So that's what we'll be looking at in this lecture. Before we go on to analyzing each freedom in turn, for example, the freedom of movement, goods, etc., we're going to actually look at, well, what actually is the mechanism by which all these freedoms operate. And the mechanism is through this thing called the EU common or internal market. And in the EU common and internal market, it's this idea that all European countries should be part of a European single market whereby goods, services, people are able to freely move between countries or from country to country without any restrictions. So you can imagine it like this. If there's someone in France who has the freedom to go to the Netherlands and to set up business there, well, that's all well and good, right? The French government might give that French citizen the freedom to go over to the Netherlands and set up his businesses. But the EU common market goes one step further. It says that not only do French citizens have the freedom to go there, but actually when they get to the Netherlands, they'll be treated the exact same way as people from the Netherlands, so Dutch people. The notion that any country's people would treat another country's people exactly the same as their own was absolutely unimaginable 100 years ago. And it's only possible today through this revolution of trade and commerce, where people have been able to see each other human beings much more on an equal footing, rather than having a divide between them. Countries will often delegate laws on the four freedoms that I'm going to look at. They'll delegate those laws to the EU, and then the EU is this overarching institution or authority who's going to coordinate trade and free markets between countries and hopefully allow people to get richer, allow people to get jobs and alleviate poverty around Europe. At least theoretically, that's the idea. So let's go on to the four freedoms themselves, right? So what exactly does the common market entail, and which areas of society, of life, are totally, not totally, but pretty much unrestricted in the European Union? Well, the first one, probably the most important, is the free movement of goods. So goods are able to travel between countries without any restrictions. People, so me, or not me after Brexit anymore, but me previously, I'm able to easily travel to any European Union country and stay there as long as I work and pay taxes, etc. Free movement of services, that is establishing businesses, offering services. And finally, the free movement of capital, that largely concerns investments or sending and receiving money. So let's begin first with the free movement of goods. When it comes to the free movement of goods, it's important to understand the definition of what goods actually mean. And in this scenario, we are thinking of any product which can be valued in money and can be exchanged. So take your pick. I've got a pear there as an icon. You could have this mobile phone, you could have lamps, TVs, furniture, you name it. And actually, when I was doing my research for this course, I actually found that human body parts also constitute goods, because technically they are something that can be valued in money and exchanged, although of course it is illegal. But goods can encompass a very, very wide range of products, and so they are a pivotal part of the internal market. It's the most commonly transacted element of the EU internal market, just because one human is able to trade many, many types of goods. Whereas if one human was to trade services, well, it would take him years to really perfect that service and then to begin to trade that. So it's much more feasible for a human being to trade many different types of goods in a year than he has to trade many different types of services. And so the law in this area is extremely voluminous. There are many, many trade regulations that students who are going to be studying or have studied EU law will come to realize can be quite boring, but it's important to understand just how important this is. And the most important aspect of this idea of free movement of goods is that there is a prohibition of customs duties and any charges of equivalent effect. Now, in my online course, Law, Goods and International Trade, I spoke about how countries adopt this thing called protectionism. And essentially, it's where they try and stop foreign goods coming into the country in order to prop up domestic goods. And there are many other reasons why countries will adopt these protectionist measures and will put up barriers and duties and charges to stop foreign goods from coming in. And the EU tries to reverse that effect. It tries to lift all these barriers and allow for one market where trade can easily come and go. Think of it like this: if you were in Belgium and you were a small business wanting to sell something to another small business in Belgium, well, there would be very, very few actual regulations from the state in that case. Most likely you would just get on the phone, create a contract with the other business, and then ship over the goods. Well, the opposite is true for a lot of countries, right? Because there's a border between countries, so the state is able to regulate what goods come in and out. What the EU wants is essentially for the whole of the EU to become, well, one state in terms of the free movement of goods, so that goods are able to freely travel between countries. Next up, we have free movement of people, perhaps the most controversial of the four freedoms, and probably what has caused a lot of turmoil, a lot of problems for the European Union in recent years, especially with Brexit, as we will look at in the next lecture. But essentially, with the free movement of people, it allows Union citizens, so EU citizens, to work, study, and travel in other EU countries without a visa. And visas can be very, very complicated and very costly as well. So by eliminating some of these barriers, the idea is that people come in and out and they're able to contribute to the whole state economy, right? Because when citizens are going over to work, they're also paying taxes. And so the whole state benefits. And the idea is that there's like this supply and demand of skills shortages. So if the UK needs a lot of plumbers, then plumbers from Romania are able to go over to the UK to fill that gap. And the idea is that the opposite would be the case. If Romania needs, I don't know, British chefs, chefs from the UK would go over to Romania in reality, that's not always the case, right? There's two problems with the free movement of people that's been highly controversial in recent years. The first one is there's this idea that it can create competition with locals, having lots of foreigners coming in to a country, that it can create competition with locals for resources such as educational facilities, healthcare, and housing. Now, I don't particularly know how much evidence is behind that. There's lots and lots of other reasons why there are long wait times in hospitals and there's not enough houses, namely to do with financing and governments cutting spending on these areas. But I think you can understand from a normal person's point of view, a normal local's point of view, why this could be such a problem, and especially if that's what they've been told in the media and by other people. I can totally empathize with why they feel like that. Whether it's based in any fact is irrelevant at this point. And the other problem is richer countries normally, with the free movement of people, have benefited more from the poorer countries, right? So I had the example of the UK and Romania exchanging people for skill shortages. Now, yeah, it might be the case that plumbers from Romania go over to the UK, but the opposite isn't really the case. Very few people from the UK travel to Eastern Europe. And actually, what you'll find with Europe in general is that Western Europe and Eastern Europe have a massive economic divide, right? There's huge inequalities there. Western Europe is far richer, far more developed than Eastern Europe. And so what you'll have is actually Eastern Europeans, educated people, people with skills, going over to Western Europe because they're able to get higher pays, more wages, progress much better in their career, get far more opportunities. But the opposite, of course, isn't the case. And so that has caused a lot of resentment, especially in Eastern Europe. So let's go on to one of the other questions, the common questions that I wanted to answer is, well, why is it so easy to travel to an EU country without a visa? And I've just explained this because EU citizens have the right of free movement. And that helps the exchange of people and ideas. I always wondered why this was the case, why I was able to travel to Spain without a visa and literally just book a flight and have my passport ready, whereas I wanted to go back to my home country, Pakistan. It was just a nightmare. Visas were expensive, they took ages, you had to go to the embassy. This is the case, right? When you have an economic union, a free market, traveling becomes much, much easier. The other common question that I think is stirred up probably in the media is it easy for people to travel in Europe and live on benefits? And this is this idea that, well, if there's free movement, surely poor peasants from poorer countries are able to simply get on a plane and go to whichever European country will be offering the most welfare. Because of course, remember, if you settle in that country, you are an EU citizen, you have to be treated the same as a local citizen. So whoever, if you get £800 in benefits in the UK, a person from Sweden is going to get £800 in benefits as well. So there's this idea of benefit shopping, which has been extremely controversial, especially because those people on welfare aren't working by definition. And so they won't be benefiting to the country through taxes. Well, the truth is, it's not actually as easy as simply benefit shopping and going to a different country and applying for welfare. Because in order to make use of free movement rights, citizens have to have EU nationality, first of all. And then additionally, they also have to be economically active. And like I said before, they have to be searching for work or working of some sort. But they can't stay there indefinitely without being economically active and looking for work and trying to get jobs. Or at least those people who have stayed on benefits for a very, very long time, let's say 5-10 years in that country, they've not done so on paper, right? It's been sort of underhanded, off the record, off the books type of stuff. So there will be some dodgy paperwork, dodgy stuff going on there somewhere, which is why they've been able to claim benefits for so long, even though they're not a national of that country. Additionally, what might also be the case is that, well, if you're a worker who comes from another country to another European country, you're allowed to bring your family, and your family don't have to be economically active. Only the one person in that family has to be economically active. So if you were a husband that came to work, your wife could be claiming benefits for a long, long time, as long as you're married to a person who is paying taxes, who is contributing to the economy. So it's not as easy as just to say that lots of these people are coming in and getting welfare. I think that's massively exaggerated. Thirdly, we have free movement of services. Exactly what this entails is a bit complicated when you look at the law. However, services make up a really, really big sector of the economy. And so the idea is that services means companies, right? So the freedom to establish companies and then provide that service and then scale up and create jobs for that country. And within this umbrella category of free movement of services, there are two rights that people are allowed to invoke when they exercise this right. And that would be, first of all, is the freedom of establishment, which allows union citizens to register and set up a business for economic activity. So that would be simply registering your company in the host state. Let's say I wanted to offer legal services or open up a law firm, then I would follow the normal procedures for opening up a law firm in that country without discrimination based on my nationality. And secondly, once you've established and set up your business, you have the freedom to then provide those services for an economic benefit, right, to make a profit. And that allows citizens to actually provide the service, and of course they are then treated the exact same as local citizens. So any discrimination based upon someone's nationality, if you have a Dutch company that's set up in France, they have to be treated the same as French citizens. They can't be discriminated against by anyone based upon their nationality. And finally, we move on to free movement of capital, perhaps the least discussed and the least controversial of the three free movements. Essentially, what this allows is for the transfer of money between EU countries with very, very minimal restrictions on that. It's helpful for investments through bonds, company shares. So if I wanted to invest in a company in Germany, there are very few restrictions for me to do that. And again, I'd be treated the exact same as normal citizens. It's also about exchanging foreign currency. So there's not as many, there's no sort of tariffs and duties that states can impose to exchange currency. And about sending and receiving cash. Say, for example, let's say through Western Union, which is a huge sort of money transfer company. So if I wanted to send money to a European country, I wouldn't pay extra fees on top of the Western Union fees. I would just go on and pay whatever that company charges. And the idea is that less restrictions on capital results in increased investment, and that leads to other economic benefits, right? So again, I spoke about foreign direct investment in the international trade course that I did, where I spoke about how when a country is given more and more economic investment, in theory, what that does is create jobs. It creates companies, services, and it creates jobs, and it alleviates poverty. In theory, that is the case. In practice, it doesn't always work out like that. There are lots of issues, corruption being the main one. But I think overall, when you look at the four freedoms and their effect and their impact that they've had on the world in the last 70 or 80 years, I think it's extraordinary. And modern day Europeans can thank whoever came up with this system for years of lasting peace and prosperity. Hello, welcome back to this final lecture, final and fifth lecture of this Introduction to EU Law online course. I think I've covered quite a lot of points that will give students a really good basis, a really good foundation to go on with their study of the European Union and especially EU law, which can be a really, really complicated, really heavy topic to study. But in this final lecture, I'm going to talk less about law and about specific provisions and stuff like that, but I'm actually going to look at challenges and things that the EU will be trying to overcome and things that might become problems in the future and later on when it inevitably begins to evolve and become a sort of different organization than it was previously. And in this lecture, I'm going to look at three specific things, three challenges that I think the EU will have to look at in the future if it wants to remain a viable, a consistent and a respected organization and keep all of its 27 member states on board. The first thing I'm going to look at is how it deals with withdrawal, right? And especially we're going to look at Brexit and some of the reasons for Brexit. Second thing I'm going to look at is financial crisis, how it's going to deal with that. We're going to look at the euro and analyze this key area a little bit more. And finally, the refugee crisis, which has been this thorn in the EU side ever since 2015. So challenge one, withdrawal from the EU. What's important to realize, especially with the EU, is that ever since its inception in 1951, the EU has constantly been enlarging and countries have been wanting to join for over 70 years now. And so in 2016, when the UK actually voted to leave, that was unprecedented by any measure. Because before 2016, and even when I was in school studying the EU, the main topic wasn't how the EU would deal with withdrawal. It was actually how the EU would deal with enlargement. And there's this, still today, there's this long list of countries who want to become part of the EU instead of this long list of countries who want to leave. Countries such as Turkey and Albania and Serbia, these countries are at the door and ready to join. And so withdrawal was always seen as an abstract concept, something that had never actually happened in practice, but has now resulted in one of its biggest challenges. In fact, what Brexit has really done is set off this chain reaction of other countries who are also looking to exit, and it's given some fire to the argument that actually there are a lot of countries around the European Union who aren't getting a benefit and who may be much closer to leaving than was previously expected. Countries like Greece and France and Netherlands all have their own Brexit-style movements. I think the French one is called Frexit, Netherlands is called Nexit, and Greece is called Grexit. So all of these countries have very, very prominent public figures and politicians who are chomping to have a referendum and to leave the European Union. When it comes to Brexit, I think what's really important is to understand a timeline and how we actually got to this point where the UK has left the EU, the first country to do so. Now, this timeline could have spanned way back to Britain's accession into the EU in the 1980s, but where I'm going to start at is in 2010. And that was when the Conservatives, a slightly more Eurosceptic party than the Labour Party, won the UK general election. In 2014, momentum began to grow for UKIP, who was the Eurosceptic party in the UK, a party whose main policy was Britain's exit from the European Union. And they began to gather so much support that they actually became the third largest party in the UK after the Conservatives and Labour. And this is remarkable because previously the third largest party was the Lib Dems, and they entered into a coalition with the Conservatives before. And so UKIP becomes the third largest party, and there's now this atmosphere in the UK where people are emboldened by leaving the EU, and the EU finally becomes this topic of discussion, not in a good way. In 2015, the Conservatives win a majority in the UK general election. They're finally in full control. And one of their promises when they were to win the election to the British people was that they would have a referendum on membership of the EU finally. And of course, what happened in 2016, against all odds, against the majority of political commentators in the UK, somehow the UK votes to leave 52 to 48. And I distinctly remember turning on the news the day after the election result was called, and remember just thinking, well, what now, right? Because for my life, at least, I was born in 1998. I've never lived a day in my life without having been a union citizen. I was always a union citizen my entire life. So after 20 years, you don't really know how to react to that kind of news. It's not traumatic. It's not a shock. Life doesn't really change. But it was just something interesting in the political sphere, and something that's unprecedented for so many people, especially in my generation. Following that, in 2017, the UK officially triggered Article 50, subsection 2 of the Treaty on the European Union. That is the specific provision whereby the head of state would send a letter to the commissioner of the EU, or I think the president of the EU, and tell them that they would like to officially withdraw from the European Union and begin the transition process to eventually be rid of all European regulation. In 2020, the UK Withdrawal Agreement Bill was passed as an Act of Parliament in the UK. Just quickly, between 2017 and 2020, or at least even 2016 and 2020, no one really had a clue what was happening. Every day there would be new news on Brexit and the EU, and it was like a political soap opera in the news every day. I mean, it is one of the biggest news stories and probably one of the longest that's existed since the turn of the new millennium in the UK. And finally, in 2021, the UK left the EU transition period and began a new relationship. So now the UK was no longer a member of the EU, but would interact with the EU as if it was a separate entity. So here's the most common question that I get asked. I remember when I was in Germany doing the year abroad, and this was in 2018, so 2 years after the Brexit referendum. And the one question I always got asked was, why did Brexit happen? What was the reason? And people were so interested, especially since it was an Erasmus program. It was an EU funded program that I was on. So why would Britain want to leave? And after doing my research, I actually realized, well, there's 4 main reasons. And these 4 reasons were given in an extensive poll that was done of Leave voters, and which asked them, well, why did you decide to vote Leave? The first reason was sovereignty. People wanted the UK to make its own laws without interference from the EU. We looked at the Principles lecture, where we looked at direct effect, indirect effect, and supremacy of EU law. And what you find is that countries give up quite a lot of their sovereignty to the European Union. in order to get economic and political benefits. People don't like that, right? People feel British and they don't want their laws coming from Brussels. They just don't want it. And so this was one of the most popular reasons as to why people voted to leave. I think the most popular reason, however, was actually immigration. People wanted the UK to regain control over its borders. Like I said, when the Free Movement of People lecture, when there are a lot of foreigners coming in and the healthcare system is in disarray, the NHS is in disarray, and there's not enough houses, and schools are over capacity, it's just too easy to blame foreigners. I mean, it has happened through generations, it's happened through history, and in this case, it's absolutely no different. The third reason was the economy. Essentially, people did not want their hard-earned money, their taxes going to the EU, which links obviously to sovereignty and immigration. They don't want the EU to become bolstered, and so they don't want their money going there. And finally, which is kind of like a fringe reason, I would say, is that actually people voted for Brexit to protest, right? People thought that by voting to leave, it would teach British politicians a lesson, a protest vote. People disillusioned with the political class, the elitist class, and it was the working class rising up and sticking it to some politicians at the top. Moving on to one of the other common questions that some people have actually asked me themselves, is that, does Brexit mean we have no more human rights? Well, I think this is a common misconception about Brexit, which states that suddenly we have no more human rights. It's not true. Most human rights laws in the UK are actually regulated by the European Convention on Human Rights, which is not affected by Brexit because the ECHR, the European Convention, is from a different organization called the Council of Europe, which is made up of 46 countries, including Russia, whereas the EU is an economic union made up of 27 countries. So no, human rights will not be massively affected. There is a European charter called the Charter of Fundamental Rights that won't apply anymore, but it's not nearly as important and not nearly as pervasive in British legislation as the European Convention. Challenge number 2 that I'm going to look at is the financial crisis, or the EU's ongoing, it seems, financial crisis. Now, I'll admit my economic knowledge, monetary, my fiscal policy knowledge isn't great. I'm a law student, that's my specialty. I know the basics, but I can't give you a detailed overview. I'm sure there are many, many people who can. Having said that, I think it's important to understand the gist of what's going on and what kind of crisis the EU is in, why this has happened, and where it's going to take them in the future. So the EU sovereign debt crisis explained by myself. Bear in mind, I'm not an expert, but this is my understanding of it. So the ECB, the European Central Bank, which I spoke about before, regulates states' monetary policy, right? So it will control their exchange rates, it will manage inflation, make sure products don't go sky high in price. But it won't manage states' fiscal policy. That is, it can't tell governments how to spend money, and it can't tell governments to not spend or to not go into debt. So what this does is it creates a divide where the ECB regulates one thing and it doesn't regulate the other. Now, before adopting the euro as their currency, which many countries in the European Union have, countries like Italy, Portugal, and Greece had a lot of debt, right? Large amounts of debt that they owed to many, many people. Private investors, institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, they owed a lot of money to people. And so because of that, because they haven't paid back their debts, they couldn't take out more big loans, because if they were to, the interest rates would be sky high and they would never get approved for more loans. However, after adopting the euro, lenders believed they were backed by stronger economies in the EU. And so if Portugal, Greece, and Italy were not able to pay back these bigger loans that they had applied for, they'd know that they had the EU as an institution that would back them up, that would pay it for them, essentially. More stronger economies like France and Germany would essentially pay back. And that's exactly what happened. And then in 2008, lenders began calling in those loans. In 2008, as you know, was the housing crisis that began in America. And that created a chain reaction of economic crisis all over the world, the global financial crisis. So all these private investors, institutions, and the World Bank began calling in their loans and saying, actually, we need that money back now, right? You can't just keep delaying it, paying minimum payments. You can't keep. The problem was these countries didn't have the money. They had no idea how to pay this back. They physically did not have the money. So the poorer countries as was expected, turned to the EU to pay off their debt. Now, this is the problem. The EU isn't some mega state that's separate from all the other states, which has a massive bank account and can pay out whenever things go wrong. The EU is made up of European countries, and the biggest of those countries is Germany. Germany is the biggest financial contributor to the European Union. So when you ask the EU to back up your loan, essentially what you're asking is for Germany to back up your loan, plus lots of small countries' contributions. And so Germany was in this very, very awkward position where it's regarded as the biggest country, the hegemon, the economic powerhouse of the European Union, yet it had this burden on its hand. It almost had a moral and social obligation to pay back the loans for its European brothers, right, in its organization. Yet at the same time, to talk to an average German and tell him that you're going to pay back billions of Greece's debt because of Greece's own fault, and they are not going to be very happy about that. And so the trade-off here was that Germany said reluctantly, okay, we'll pay back your debts, Greece, Italy, Spain, etc. However, there's one condition, and these countries had to implement austerity measures. Austerity measures meaning cutting public services, cutting wages, cutting jobs. And when you implement these austerity measures in these countries, inevitably that leads to cancelled investment projects like new buildings and skyscrapers and things like that, cutting salaries from people, especially in the public sector, and job losses, right? Just cutting jobs completely. And so now in 2021, we have this problem where without a central European Union authority to regulate monetary and fiscal policy, that is, regulate how Greece and Portugal and Spain are able to borrow money, this crisis is just going to continue. But having this central authority, this EU central authority, is, as you can imagine, hugely controversial. Because we said previously, already the EU takes up a lot of the country's sovereignty in terms of lawmaking powers. To do that for economics as well, for monetary and fiscal policy, that is going to be a very tough sell for normal, average Europeans. It does beg the question then, well, why do countries even adopt the euro as their currency in the first place? Well, the idea initially was to make trading with other EU countries easier and more efficient, and of course to borrow money at lower interest rates. When you have different countries who have different currencies, it's just an extra barrier that makes trading a little bit more difficult. Whereas when two countries have the same currency, people can trade without any hesitation and without having to exchange money first before selling and buying products. And of course, for slightly poorer countries who had a lot of debt, this was a no-brainer. Imagine being able to take out more loans knowing that there's this massive European institution that's going to back you if everything goes to shit. And finally, we get on to what I think, at least, is probably the most heartbreaking of challenges in the European Union, which is the refugee crisis. Swaths of people from the Middle East and North Africa coming on boats, these boats capsizing, people drowning, babies being washed up on shore. It's a humanitarian catastrophe, something that the European Union, which I'll explain, has to deal with whether it likes it or not. These are the statistics from which countries the majority of refugees actually come from. And as you can see, it's normally the same type of countries: Syria, Afghanistan, Eritrea, Kosovo, all these countries with very unstable governments, all countries which have been colonized at some point by European countries in the past. And so today there's this deadly power struggle between different groups, which of course the losers are always the people in the end, because they're the ones that have to live in abject poverty and disease and war. And so a lot of these refugees have fled these countries because they don't want that life for their kids. And they've fled because of numerous reasons: war and persecution and lack of opportunity, etc. Now, the problem for Europe is that as a continent, is that when refugees travel from the Middle East and North Africa, they don't travel in equal numbers to each European country. So you don't get 1,000 refugees landing in Britain, 1,000 in Germany, 1,000 in Belgium, 1,000 in Sweden. That would be great if that was the case. It'd be a much more manageable workload. But that's not the case, right? Because refugees don't take planes to travel. What they do is they get on a boat, or they walk, or they take public transport. And all these forms of transport travel in a linear fashion from one state to the next to the next. And so when you have most of the refugees coming from North Africa and from the Middle East, they have to go through Eastern Europe, and then they go from east to west. And so we have this crazy situation where since Western Europe is more developed and much richer than Eastern Europe, it's probably got a better capacity, a bigger capacity to take on these refugees. Yet the majority of the refugees aren't there. They're actually in Eastern Europe. In Eastern Europe, where they don't have the resources to care for them, they also don't have very favorable attitudes towards immigrants in general. And so this, I think, is what has compounded the humanitarian crisis and made it far, far worse than anyone could imagine. So finally, the question is, why are there so many refugees coming into Europe? Well, Europe is quite well developed. It's got a lot of economic opportunities. You can apply for welfare until you get on your feet and then apply for a job. There's many, many industries. There's low skilled, there's high skilled labor, there's an ability to get education. And, you've got freedom to pretty much do what you want. Europeans will protect your human rights. And so it's a no-brainer that migrants want to settle in Europe, not for any other reason than to provide a better future for their kids. That's it. Well, I think what's really interesting is, let's take an alternative to history, right? Let's say that the Middle East was actually peaceful, North Africa was peaceful, there's very little war and persecution. And let's say the refugees were coming from South America, right? Mexico, Costa Rica, Venezuela, these kind of countries. Then actually, I think what you would have is a much more manageable situation, because those countries would be arriving into Western Europe instead of East first. And of course, as we said, Western Europe has a much better capacity to deal with refugees, to deal with more people than does Eastern Europe. And so perhaps the situation wouldn't be as destructive and as chaotic as it is today. But of course, this is my opinion without any evidence. It's wishful thinking. And whether it's true, unless you travel to an alternate dimension, you'll never know. And that brings us to the end of this Introduction to European Union Law online course. I want to end in this final picture that I got shown when I was doing a EU law class. And it was this idea that, today we take peace for granted, at least as Europeans. We absolutely take peace for granted. And when you look at this timeline here, and you look at Europe as a continent, you'll see that there is actually a lot of grey compared to the blue. And without the 70 years of peace that we've had, beginning in 1945, actually before that, Europe was a continent ravaged by war continuously, whether it was small skirmishes here and there or full-on battles between states. And I add in this final question to this lasting 70 years of peace, where I say, well, will it last? The European Union is facing challenges that it has never faced before. If that means dissolution of the European Union, does that mean that however civilized people are, however much people hate war today, is that really a prerequisite for avoiding war altogether and avoiding conflict altogether? I don't know. I see history as repeating itself over and over again, especially when you read books on this kind of stuff. I'm sure that the people in the 1800s would have thought that they were much, much more civilized than the people in the 1500s. Yet, what happened? There was war in the 1500s and there was war in the 1800s. And who knows if this will continue in the future. I certainly hope it does, but it can't happen without work. It can't happen without education. And it certainly won't happen with dividing borders and conflicts between people. As I mentioned, if you are interested in learning more about this course, feel free to check out this textbook by Christine Bernard on EU law. It's an excellent resource, and thank you very much for watching.